Okay, folks, we are starting chapter 4, and chapter 4 deals with exponential as well as logarithmic equations, which are inverse functions. So before we get started, just a reminder here, these are the two calculators that I recommend or that I would suggest you have. Notice I've got two buttons highlighted here on each one. You will have to have a calculator that has these functions for this chapter. So if you've been using a regular for function or a simpler calculator, then you need to make sure you have this kind of calculator. You need a log button and a ln, which is natural log, and the functions above them as well, e to the x and x 10 to the x. So make sure you have a calculator that has these functions. Okay, so we're looking at inverse functions to start off with. So we're going to be doing exponential and log functions. They are inverses. So it helps to understand what inverses mean or what they represent. So basically, this first part, they're going to ask you to find the inverse. So I'm going to make this real simple. Here's your rule. If you remember this for this section, then you should be fine. And the rule is reverse the x and y coordinates. Okay? So we're going to look at inverse functions when they give you points. We're going to look at inverse functions when they give you a graph. We're going to look at inverse functions when they give you an equation. Almost all of them, you're going to just simply reverse the x and y coordinates. Okay? So let's take a look at points first. So here is our given values. And you notice up here in the example, it says if f of 5 equals 3, then the inverse, notice we have this -1, that stands for the inverse. The inverse function of 3 would equal 5. So notice here, x was 5, y was 3. Now x is 3, y is 5. So we're just switching the x and y coordinates. So here's the values for our function. We don't have a function rule or an equation. We just have the values for the functions. So that's all we're going to worry about. And all we need to do is just switch them. So the inverse function of 11, well, up here, f of 7 equaled 11. So that means the inverse function of 11 would equal 7. The inverse function of 6, well, f of 2 equals 6, so this would equal 2. And the inverse function of 8, f of 3 equals 8, so the inverse function of 8 would equal 3. And some of you might be looking at this and saying, that's really simple. And I'm going to say, yes, it is really simple. Don't overcomplicate it. This is a very easy section. Okay, the second way is when they give you actual points, not in function form, but in point form. So notice here are your points. We have 2, 5, 4, 7, 6, 9, 12, 15, and over here are our inverse points. We have just switched the x and y coordinates. So again, simply just swap x and y coordinates. Now, I'll caution you, when you do a question like this, it's probably not going to be just 4 points. It's probably going to be multiple choice, and there may be as many as 8 or 12 points. So make sure you check carefully and look at every single point and make sure the answer you choose, every single x and y have been swapped. Okay? Here's the third way on a graph. So we're not actually graphing these, but we're going to be looking at it on a graph. So on the graph, again, swap the x and y coordinates of each point. So here you can see this is our function, f of x, and they've given us 3 points on the graph. Over here is our inverse function, f inverse of x. And 4, 3 becomes 3, 4. 1, -3 becomes -3, 1. And 0, -5 becomes -5, 0. So again, can't say this enough times, swap the x and y coordinates of each point. So for this one, you're going to have to pick the right graph. Just switch the x and y coordinates. Okay, the last one is when they give it to us in an equation. This is the only one where you have to actually do some work. So here's our function, f of x equals 3x minus 7. Here's the inverse of that function. Notice you can write it as one big fraction, or you can separate it into two separate fractions. Either way is correct. So here are your steps. Again, don't overcomplicate this. It's a simple process. So number one, we're going to replace f of x with y. So we're going to go from function form to equation form. And we're doing that because we need to swap the x and y in the equation. So we don't need an f of x, we really need a y to do this. So once we swap, we're going to solve in terms of y. And then we're going to put it back in function form by replacing the y with f of x. So let me walk you through this one. This is basically solving an equation. So first off, we're going to rewrite this. This is y equals 2x plus 13. And then we're going to switch the x and y's. So just exchange places. So x equals 2y plus 13. And now we're going to solve in terms of y. So if I'm solving in terms of y, I'm going to subtract 13 from both sides. So I get x minus 13 equals 2y. Make that a y. It looks like a y. There we go. And then we're going to divide by 2. So the 2's cancel out here, and we're left with y. And y equals all of this, x minus 13 over 2. I would leave it as a fraction. And then we're going to replace the y with the inverse of x, or put it back in function form. So the inverse function of x is x minus 13 all over 2. And again, work carefully, copy your numbers carefully, and you should get your inverse. All right, I'm going to do one more example just so you guys have another one if you want to add this to your notes. So let's say f of x is, let's make it, doesn't have to be too hard, 4x minus 7. This is about as hard as they're going to get. So again, we're going to change this to a y. We're going to swap the x's and y's. So x equals 4y minus 7. We're going to subtract 7, or sorry, this time add 7 to both sides. So x plus 7 equals 4y. And then finally divide by 4. Got a y. There we go. So back up here, we've got y equals x plus 7 over 4. And we just change it back to function notation. So the inverse function of x is equal to x plus 7 over 4. So that is the only one for the inverses that you have to do any calculations with. And remember, we're not solving for x or y. We're just getting it in different format. So we're not going to plug in any values for x and solve it. We're just going to rewrite the equation for the inverse. Okay, so that is it for section 1. It's fairly short. And again, if you remember for the first 3, the biggest thing to keep in mind is you're swapping the x and y values, or the x and y coordinates. So work carefully when you're doing your work, copy your numbers carefully, and watch your negatives as always. And that is it for section 1. We will see you for section 2.